Thank you, Rennie. Hi, everyone. My name's John. I'm a healthcare analyst here at CB Insights. As Rennie mentioned, before I joined CB Insights, I worked in clinical research, specifically in neurology and oncology. And during that experience, I had the chance to observe and interact with a lot of patients as they navigated through their own clinical trials. And that's what I'll be discussing here today, the patient journey experience, highlighting some of the inefficiencies with the current model and how that ultimately slows down the drug development process. Later on, Deepa will share how artificial intelligence will impact this space, along with the solutions it offers, and point out some of the interesting startups in the industry. So to start, I want to share this graphic here to show how long of a process it actually is to bring a drug to market. As you can see, if we start with 10 promising drugs that come out of the lab to move on to testing with actual patients, there may be one that makes it to the FDA for their decision. So you can imagine the odds of a successful drug. This entire process could take a decade or more depending on the specific nature of the drug. And as you move from phase 1 to phase 3 in a clinical trial, the time and money going into each phase increases. So when trials come up for phase 3 and fail, it can be a very costly failure. But the human cost of failed trials is in the patient story. A lot of patients want to participate in clinical trials because existing treatments have failed, and by that point, they're already dealing with both financial and emotional stress. And on top of that, it's not an easy process for them to navigate. For example, if you take cancer alone, it's estimated that more than 1.7 million people in the US will be diagnosed with cancer this year. Now, compared to that large number, the current enrollment rate for cancer clinical trials is less than 5%. And obviously not everyone that's diagnosed with cancer needs to enroll in a clinical trial, but this small percentage does suggest that it's a much larger problem, seeing as how most patients, as we'll see later, can't even easily access the information needed to participate in clinical trials. And aside from the patient perspective, this process is inefficient for other stakeholders as well, including pharmaceutical companies. The average time to start and finish a clinical trial takes nearly a decade. And on top of that, it can cost up to $2 billion per drug. That number comes from paying for salaries, administrative costs, patient incentivizing fees, and for site management costs. So what does this all mean? It means that this $65 billion clinical trials market is overdue for a makeover. It needs more efficient ways to appeal to patients, and pharma companies should approach this market with digitization and AI technology in mind, as Deepa will be discussing in a little bit. So let's take a look at what this process typically looks like from the patient's perspective. The main parts of the patient journey that I'll be discussing are finding and enrolling in clinical trials, along with the medication adherence and monitoring throughout their participation. Starting with the challenge of finding and enrolling in the right clinical trial, this is proving to be a huge challenge for patients. Typically, the patient would look to enroll in a clinical trial after standard treatments have failed to treat their condition. So let's say for a hypothetical cancer patient, he or she has had chemotherapy or radiation therapy without much success. They may look to a clinical trial for an experimental therapy option. And their doctors may be able to refer them to specific hospitals for potential openings and ongoing clinical trials. But if they don't have that information readily available, the burden of finding a trial is put on the patient. And they may look to an advocacy or nonprofit organization that's specific to their condition for more resources. Or they themselves may have to look through clinicaltrials.gov, which is the federal database for all ongoing clinical trials. And to give you an idea of how complex this database is, there are more than 18,000 registered clinical studies that are currently recruiting in the US alone. So I went to the website and did a quick search for all breast cancer trials in the US just to see how accessible this resource was for patients. And I found 941 studies that were currently recruiting, which, if you can imagine being a patient with breast cancer, it would be very overwhelming to scan through each of these studies and see which ones they qualify for. And I clicked on one of those studies to check out what the inclusion criteria look like. And as you can see, it's pretty heavy with medical jargon and would be very difficult for the patient to make sense of. When I worked on clinical trials, very few patients actually went through all of this information. Instead, they would end up calling us directly for more information and actually came into the site for further questions. When patients come in to see if they qualify for a trial, they usually have to get blood tests, imaging scans, and other assessments according to that specific study's protocol. And this could take several weeks or multiple visits to get done, depending on the patient's availability. And as part of determining their eligibility, doctors have to collect and consolidate a patient's medical records to confirm past history of treatments to check off the inclusion criteria. This is usually done via fax, and the study team manually extracts the relevant information from those records. And this is where there's a potential roadblock for data when we talk about AI solutions in the clinical trial space, because even structured data in one EHR system can be turned into unstructured data once it's faxed over. When I handled patient medical records, some of the faxes that we received weren't even legible at times, and we would need to request the records again. This not only slows down the patient enrollment process, but also prevents a streamlined approach to capturing real-world data. And all of those factors result in nearly 80% of clinical trials failing to meet enrollment timelines. This is a huge detriment to studying promising drug candidates, because on one hand, you have these trial sites that can't find enough patients. On the other hand, you have patients that can't easily find these studies. And to go over how AI can help streamline this process, I'm now going to hand it over to Deepa to discuss some of the developments in this space.
Thank you, Dra. Hi everyone, I'm Deepa and I cover AI at CB Insights. The ideal solution for this enrollment bottleneck is that you have an AI software that can crunch all of the patient's medical data, compare it with ongoing clinical trials, and automatically suggest the right pool of patients for the right trial. In fact, if you look at the top two categories within healthcare AI, where all the startup deals are going, it's imaging and diagnostics, where startups are using computer vision and deep learning to extract information from MRI, CT scans, and other medical images. And the second most popular category here is clinical insights and risk analytics, which includes using natural language processing to extract information from electronic health records. Before we look at startups working with clients in the clinical trial space, it's important to understand some of the challenges that are unique to the healthcare industry in many ways. Healthcare has many disparate data sources. So you have data in EHR software, different hospitals may follow different formats for entering patient information. You have handwritten notes, which may contain spelling mistakes, jargon that the algorithm needs to be trained to understand, and some acronyms, for example, could mean two different things in two different fields of study. On top of that, as Ja mentioned, even structured data can become unstructured when, say, one hospital faxes over information to another or sends the information as an unreadable PDF file. So this is some of the challenges on the technical side. When you look at the business model and the implementation side, how do these AI startups access patient data? If I visit 4 different hospitals in the United States, each of them may use a different EHR software, and these EHR systems don't communicate with each other. So there is no central repository of patient data. My information could be scattered across 4 different databases. So what this means is that a lot of the times patients don't have access to their own medical history. One approach that some AI startups are taking is requesting permission to collect all the medical data on the patient's behalf. So they take care of all the administrative work and contacting different hospitals, etc. The more common approach is partnering with specific health institutions, adding a layer of AI analytics on top of the existing electronic health record system. One early stage company doing this is Deep6 AI, which uses deep learning and natural language processing to automate clinical trial matching. Although they've not raised since 2016, they recently partnered with TD2 and Oncology CRO, and they've worked with clients like Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Another startup that has gained traction with pharma companies like Merck is Antidote. They specifically focus on the inclusion and exclusion criteria that Josh showed you earlier, which can be very heavy with medical jargon and difficult for the patient to navigate. So patients can directly go on Antidote's website and answer a simple questionnaire. Apart from that, Antidote has also partnered with clinical study researchers and care institutions to make their trial matching tool available on third-party websites. Another interesting model is how Flatiron approached this. You may be aware of the company. They were acquired by Roche for nearly $2 billion this year, in one of the biggest acquisitions of a company using machine learning in healthcare. What's interesting is that in 2014, Flatiron was selling its cloud analytics platform to healthcare and life science companies, and then they went ahead and acquired Altos Solutions, which was an oncology EMR that was being used by institutions like the Florida Cancer Specialists. So this deal gave Flatiron direct access to raw patient data. Instead of depending on access to third-party EMRs. So today, Flatiron's EMR tool is used by more than 2,000 clinicians, and they have access to over 2 million active patient records for research purposes. Now, Roche already has a strong oncology pipeline, so this acquisition makes sense for them, but it also underscores how particular pharma companies are in rebranding themselves and being more allowing data and machine learning to drive a lot of their business decisions. Now, what if there was an alternate stream of data other than depending on EHRs? An interesting area that is opening up new possibilities for AI applications in clinical studies is patient-generated data, and that's precisely what Apple has created. So Apple is building a clinical research ecosystem around two of its most popular devices, the iPhone and the Apple Watch. Data is at the core of all AI applications, and now by continuously monitoring patients in the comfort of their homes, Apple can generate a treasure trove of data that was previously unavailable. In 2015, Apple launched two open source frameworks, ResearchKit and CareKit. So using these frameworks, medical researchers can develop apps to monitor people's daily lives. And say patients can download the apps and participate remotely in some of these studies, drastically simplifying the recruitment process. For example, one popular use case was when Duke University developed an app for autism, and using the iPhone's front camera and facial recognition algorithms, they were able to screen children for autism. Another popular app was Empower for Parkinson's disease, where researchers used, again, sensors on the phone as well as exercises like finger tapping and gait analysis to study patients. Since then, more than 3 million people have participated in different studies using ResearchKit and CareKit. One futuristic use case could be, as many of you know, some trials have an experimental group where patients get the study drug and a control group where patients are given a placebo drug. So the point of the control group is to establish a baseline to compare symptoms to the experimental group's symptoms. And often patients are unaware of which drug they're taking. So with patient-generated data like what Apple is doing or Google is doing with its Project Baseline on a smaller scale, is that it could eliminate the need for a control group because it's providing the data required from the control and could ultimately help in reducing some of the recruitment bottlenecks that Ja discussed earlier. On top of patient-generated data, in January this year, Apple announced that iPhone users will now have access to all their electronic health records from participating institutions. So if I go to 4 institutions in Apple's partner network, I can get all of my EHR data, which was one of the biggest challenges in healthcare data sharing. I can now access all of that data in one place on my iPhone. And this drastically simplifies how information flows in healthcare, as well as consent, because users can share that data now with third-party developers. And so it simplifies the entire process for both the patient as well as the study researchers. And this idea of EHR accessibility appears to be an extension of what this startup called Glimpse was working on in 2016 before they were acquired by Apple. So Apple has made very strategic moves in expanding into this healthcare space. So with all of this, as we saw, with all this data coming in, there's new possibilities with AI and machine learning. It can be, not only can these frameworks be used to enroll the right pool of patients, the data collected from here can be analyzed and used in driving decisions in drug design, in early disease diagnosis, and of course, remote monitoring. So a big challenge for clinical researchers is monitoring patients once they leave the study site. Especially, how do you make sure they're taking the study drug and adhering to the study protocol when they're at home? Jia can speak to this in more detail and walk you through the current practices before we can see where there is an opportunity for AI here.
Yes, so that's definitely a huge challenge that we're seeing in clinical trials, making sure that patients are actually taking the study drug and adhering to the study protocol expectations. For example, we gave patients a set of paper diaries to document details like the time they took the study drug, what other medications they've taken, and any adverse events that they may have experienced, like headaches or muscle aches. Now, what tends to happen is that sometimes the patient will forget to document the exact time they took the study drug, or forget to write down the dosage of any outside medications that they've taken. You can imagine how difficult it is for the patient to document everything in real time by carrying around a stack of papers. And this is why medication adherence tracking is such an imperfect process right now. As part of their regular check-ins with the study doctor and to get refills on the study drug, patients have to travel to this trial site frequently. And this is especially hard for out-of-state patients that have to drive a long distance or fly out. It all adds more stress and increases the likelihood of them dropping out of the trial. Another reason that patients may drop out of a trial is because of severe adverse events related to the study drug. They self-report some of these side effects in their patient diaries, so that when they come in for these follow-up visits, one of the things that the study doctor will confirm will be how severe these side effects were, from light to moderate to severe. And this is why tracking adherence is prone to human error, due to the manual process that's involved in documentation. This graphic here illustrates a pretty common conversation that I've seen happen between the patient and the study doctor. Let's say the patient diary is missing the time entry of when they took the study drug from about 2 weeks ago. The doctor will ask if the patient remembers when they took it. And usually the patient will estimate the time that they think that they took the study drug. This is purely a guess by this point, as it's pretty hard to remember such details from 2 weeks ago, and this can obscure the data that's being captured. Also, as part of confirming adherence, the doctor makes sure that the amount of pills left over in the pill bottle matches up with the patient diary entries. And by that, I mean if the patient took all of his or her study drug pills and documented the exact times they took them in the diary, there would presumably be no pills left over. This is just another way to confirm medication adherence. And non-adherence can cause side effects and affect patients' health, while also raising costs for study sponsors and interfere with the accuracy of the study outcomes. So as a result, medication adherence and remote monitoring is an area that we're seeing AI applications emerge, which Deepa will walk you through now.
Thanks, Jia. Pharma companies especially are serious about solving or tracking non-adherence. For example, we saw Pfizer and Novartis invest in ingestible sensors. Merck invested in MediSafe, which develops wireless pill bottles. But computer vision algorithms have opened up another way of tracking adherence. A New York-based mobile SaaS company called AI Cure is developing AI solutions to visually confirm 3 different things. 1, facial recognition to identify the patient, pill recognition to make sure they're ingesting the right pill, and also attempting to confirm that the pill is actually being ingested. After a series of grants from the National Institute of Health and Institute of Drug Abuse, among others, the company raised over $27 million in equity funding. Another approach is using an AI healthcare companion or a bot. So for example, Catalia Health was backed by Khosla Ventures in the early stages. They're developing a robot that sets reminders and tailors conversations to each patient. Right now, it appears to be a tablet with a touch screen, but the startup is reportedly also working on voice activation as well. And as with everything else in AI assistance, ability to successfully enforce these lifestyle changes largely depends on patients' willingness to interact with it on a daily basis. Another emerging trend that we're seeing here is fusing biosensors with AI. Here's a market map. The entire map is available to our clients, but just to highlight two of the categories with at-home monitoring devices that are also using machine learning to process all of that data that is coming in from these devices. So some companies are building both sensors and the AI software to analyze the data collected by these sensors. For example, Continuous Biometrics is developing its own sensing technology, and they monitor more than 20 bioparameters like heart rate, glucose levels, blood pressures, and these are some of the standard biometrics measured during when patients visit the trial site for regular checkups. They raised a 20 million Series B recently this year. Other companies may only develop, say, the software analytics layer and integrate with FDA-approved home monitoring devices. So as we move forward, AI IoT will play a critical role in monitoring of physiological and behavioral changes in patients and potentially reduce the cost, frequency, and difficulty of frequent on-site checkups. And as study sponsors move more towards virtual clinical trials wherever possible, IoT, AI, computer vision algorithms might soon play a big role in facial and emotional recognition, for example, monitoring behavioral traits, especially if the interviews with patients are conducted remotely. One company that we know is already doing siteless trials using a local network of care providers, but also mobile nurses, as well as home monitoring devices, is Science37. So this is definitely a trend that we'll be watching out for in the coming months. Before we wrap up this webinar and open up to questions, I just wanted to show our clients where they can access some of this information on our platform. If you click on the links here in the PDF that Rennie will be soon sending out, you can access our AI in healthcare collection and filter by drug development and clinical trials to see some of the companies there, as well as we have a broader clinical trials technology collection, which includes AI as well as other technologies being used for clinical trial monitoring. And at the bottom, you can also see some of the companies that we discussed today and their profile pages. So we'll take a couple of questions right now. But if we don't get to it, please tweet at us or email us, and we will get back to you as soon as we are able to. One question is, what is the biggest obstacle to adopting these technologies in clinical trials?
Okay, I can take that question. Well, since these technologies are pretty new and there are the traditionally accepted procedures with how clinical trials are being conducted currently, there might be some skepticism in how exactly it would work to protect patient confidentiality, especially when you're dealing with patients' protected health information. It's understandable that some healthcare professionals may be resistant to the idea at first, but I think if done correctly, I do think this type of emerging tech can really help break down a lot of the bottlenecks that we're seeing with recruitment issues and also increase accessibility for patients to start finding the trials that they need. And I think a lot of that begins with digitization of records and less reliance on manual paper entry type of documentation.
There's another question on digitization that I think Jaj has covered a little bit right now, but also adding to that, there is no one-stop shop for AI solutions across the clinical trial process. As we saw today, there are so many different technologies, from remote monitoring to extracting medical data to cybersecurity, which we didn't touch upon today. So that is another thing to consider, that so many different moving parts in the entire clinical trial process. Another question that we have is, is there any skepticism about what AI can actually solve today for the industry? There have been a lot of developments in the accuracy of computer vision algorithms, image recognition, as well as natural language processing, thanks to deep learning in the last couple of years. But as we discussed today, there are data challenges unique to healthcare. Many of the companies in the broader AI ecosystem, not just in healthcare, we track AI across more than 25 different industries. Majority of them are still very new and at very early stages of funding. It is also important to be aware of what data the algorithms are being trained on, how they're trained, and also to be aware of which application that you're trying to target and what AI can and can't do. And as Ja mentioned before, in a lot of places there is room for reducing a lot of the manual paperwork, to eliminating human error, to move to digital copies instead of physical ones before AI you can use AI to extract and analyze that information in an efficient way. I think, yeah, if you can email us any other questions that you have, we will be happy to, we'll get back to you. Either Ja or I will reply to it as soon as we're able to. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.